"You should thank me, Rosalind," Denise said, smiling at me across the reception table as if she were handing me a compliment instead of a confession. "I gave your marriage the mercy it needed." The words landed somewhere under my ribs and stayed there, cold and small. 42 years of friendship, 10 years of marriage to Gerald, and one mirror wrapped in silver paper that I had hung with my own hands above our fireplace. I smiled back at her because there was something in that reception hall my former best friend did not know I already understood. My name is Rosalind Hartley, and I am 68 years old. And for a long time, I believed that loyalty was a thing you could measure the way you measure flour for bread. Carefully, honestly, in exact amounts, and it would rise the same way every time. I built my life on that belief. I built it around a woman named Denise Calloway, who I had known since we were 19 years old and sharing a 2-room apartment above a laundromat in Millbrook. Both of us broke. Both of us certain the whole world was going to open up for us if we were only patient enough to wait for it. Denise did not have family who cared much for her, not the way mine did, and so over the years I folded her into my own. She sat at our table every Thanksgiving. She held my hand in the hospital hallway when my mother died. When Gerald and I married, 29 years ago last spring, Denise stood beside me at the altar in a pale blue dress, and I remember thinking, with the kind of certainty you only have when you are young and have not yet been taught otherwise, that I was the luckiest woman alive to have a friend like that. I gave her money, over the years, more than I ever told Gerald, because that is what you do for someone you love. You do not keep score, or you tell yourself you do not, even while some quiet accountant in the back of your mind keeps the ledger anyway. $6,000 when her car was repossessed in 2009. A summer's rent when her second marriage ended and she had nowhere else to go. I co-signed a loan for her business, a little flower shop that failed within 18 months, and I never once asked her to pay me back, and she never once offered. I remember the 2-room apartment above the laundromat more clearly than I remember whole decades that came after it. The radiator only worked if you kicked it in the right spot. The smell of fabric softener drifted up through the floorboards every evening around 6. Denise used to sit cross-legged on the counter, eating cereal straight from the box, telling me about the life she was going to have. A house with a wraparound porch, a husband who adored her, children who would never for one single day doubt that they were loved. I believed every word of it, because I wanted it for her as much as I wanted it for myself, and because that is what 19-year-old girls do for each other before the world teaches them to keep anything back. She did not get the porch or the adoring husband, not the first time or the second. Her first marriage ended after 4 years when her husband left for a woman he'd met at a conference in Denver, and I was the one who drove 6 hours through a snowstorm to bring her home, who sat with her in my own guest room for 3 weeks while she cried into a pillow I eventually had to throw away because nothing could get the grief smell out of it. Her second marriage ended more quietly, with less drama and more debt, and it was after that one that the flower shop came into being. Her idea entirely, though I was the one who signed the loan papers at the credit union, my name beside hers, because the loan officer had looked at her credit history and shaken his head, and I could not stand to watch her humiliated in a room with fluorescent lighting, and a man in a cheap tie. I do not say any of this bitterly. I say it because I want you to understand the shape of the friendship before I tell you how it ended, because betrayal only makes sense against the backdrop of what came before it. You cannot understand the weight of a stone unless you know how far it fell. My mother used to say that the measure of a friendship is not what it costs you when things are easy, but what it costs you when things are hard, and whether you pay that cost willingly or with resentment curling underneath it like smoke under a door. She died 11 years ago, of a slow illness that gave us time to say everything we needed to say to each other, which I have always considered a strange kind of mercy, even in the middle of losing her. In her last weeks, she told me she worried about exactly one thing regarding my life, that I gave too freely, to too many people, without asking enough in return, and that one day, someone was going to mistake my generosity for an absence of boundaries, rather than the deliberate, chosen thing it actually was. I did not understand what she meant until the year everything with Denise and Gerald unfolded, and I thought of her often during those months. Not for comfort exactly, though there was some of that too, but because I found myself, for the first time in my adult life, drawing on a kind of steel I did not know I had inherited from her until I actually needed it. She had buried a husband, raised 4 children largely alone after that, and never once, in all the years I watched her, allowed anyone to mistake her softness for weakness. I understood, sitting at my own kitchen table with that yellow legal pad in front of me, that I was finally becoming the daughter she had always quietly hoped I would grow into, even if it took a mirror and a betrayal to get me there. By the time of our 10th anniversary, I had given Denise, by my own rough accounting, something in the neighborhood of $11,000 across 2 decades, not counting the countless smaller kindnesses that never made it onto any ledger, the meals, the rides, the hours of listening on her worst nights. I want to be clear that I do not regret a single dollar of it, even now, even knowing what I know. I regret only that I never once, in 42 years, asked her what she was giving me in return, and whether the answer, had I asked it honestly, would have troubled me long before any mirror ever came into it. I tell you all of this not to complain about it. I tell you this so you understand what it means when I say that on the 10th anniversary of my marriage to Gerald, Denise Calloway arrived at our home with a gift wrapped in silver paper, and I unwrapped it in front of my husband, my sister, and 6 of our closest friends, with no idea that I was holding the first stone in a wall that was being built, brick by brick, to shut me out of my own life. The mirror was old, antique, Denise said, from an estate sale outside of Savannah. It had a heavy bronze frame, ornate at the edges, tarnished in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental, like someone had polished the tarnish itself. For the woman who has everything, Denise said, and everyone laughed, and I laughed too, and I hung it above our fireplace that very night because Gerald said it gave the room a kind of gravity it had been missing. I should tell you about Gerald, too, because a marriage like ours does not collapse in a vacuum, and I do not want you to think I am painting myself as a saint who married a monster and simply waited patiently for the monster to reveal his true face. Gerald Hartley was, for most of the 29 years I knew him, a genuinely good man. Not a perfect one, but a good one, which is a rarer and more valuable thing. He ran the hardware store his father had started, and he ran it honestly, extending credit to families who needed a little more time to pay, remembering the names of every regular customer's children, closing early on Christmas Eve every single year so his employees could get home to their families, even though it cost him money he could have used. We met at a church potluck, of all places, when I was 39 and newly divorced from a first marriage that had ended not in betrayal, but in simple, quiet incompatibility. 2 people who had married too young and grown into versions of themselves that no longer fit together. Gerald brought a casserole dish that, I found out later, his mother had actually made, because he could not cook a single thing beyond scrambled eggs, and when I teased him about it, he laughed so hard he had to set his plate down. I married him 18 months later in a small ceremony in my sister's backyard, and Denise stood beside me the entire time in that pale blue dress. And I remember thinking that I had never seen her look happier for me, and I believed, for 28 more years, that the happiness I saw on her face that day had been real. Our marriage was not without its ordinary difficulties. The year his store nearly went under during the recession, the miscarriage I suffered in our 3rd year together that neither of us spoke about for a long time afterward, the small, ongoing negotiation of 2 strong-willed people learning how to share a life without erasing themselves in the process. But it was, by any honest measure, a good marriage, built the way good things are usually built, slowly, with attention, by 2 people who kept choosing each other on ordinary days when nobody was watching, and no romance novel was writing the scene for them. That is what makes what happened afterwards so difficult to reconcile, even now. It is easier, in some ways, to lose a bad marriage. You can tell yourself you are well rid of it. I did not have that comfort. I lost something that had, for most of its life, actually been good. I want to tell you about the pattern before I tell you about the plan, because the pattern is the part that still makes my chest tighten when I think back on it. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was so quiet. Betrayal, I have learned, rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as a headache, as tiredness, as a man who used to reach for your hand in his sleep, suddenly turning his back to you in the dark. It started 3 weeks after the anniversary party. Small things. Gerald stopped humming in the shower, a habit of 29 years that had annoyed me so consistently, I had grown to love it the way you love the creak in an old staircase. He began working later at the hardware store he had run since before I met him, and when I called to ask if he wanted me to bring dinner, his voice had a flatness in it I did not recognize, as if he were speaking to me through a wall of glass. Then came the mirror itself, not the object, but its effect. I began to notice that whenever Gerald stood in front of it, something in his face changed. A tightness around the eyes. A kind of distance, as though he were looking not at his own reflection, but past it, at something standing just behind me. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself that 10 years of marriage sometimes hits a fog bank, and you simply keep driving slowly until you come out the other side. But then he started saying things. Small, sharp things, delivered so casually, I almost missed them the first few times. You've gotten so controlling, Roz. I don't know when you became this person. Denise says you've always been like this, actually. She just never wanted to tell me. That last one stopped me cold, standing at the kitchen sink with a dish towel in my hand, because I realized my husband and my best friend had apparently been having conversations about me that I knew nothing about, conversations in which I was being reconstructed, piece by piece, into someone I did not recognize. There were other things, smaller still, that I cataloged without meaning to, the way you notice a draft in a house before you ever find the crack in the window frame that's letting it in. Gerald began leaving his phone face down on the kitchen counter, a habit he had never had in 29 years of marriage, and when it buzzed, he would glance at it and then at me, quickly, as if checking whether I had seen. He started going to bed before me, which had never once happened in a decade. Gerald being a night owl who used to fall asleep with the television, murmuring some old Western at 2 a.m. while I read beside him. Now, he was under the covers by 9:30, his back to my side of the bed, and when I slid in beside him, the muscles along his shoulders would tense, almost imperceptibly, the way a person tenses when they are pretending to already be asleep. He stopped calling me Rose, which he had called me since our second date, and started calling me Rosalind instead, formally, the way you'd address a stranger at a bank. He began commenting on my cooking in a way that felt less like observation and more like comparison, as though he were quietly measuring every meal against some unspoken standard I could not see. "This is good," he said once, about a chicken dish I had made 100 times over the years. Different than usual, though, and I stood at the stove for a long moment afterward trying to work out what exactly had changed, before I understood, much later, that nothing about the chicken had changed at all. Small things. I want you to understand how small they were, and how much they added up to nonetheless, the way 1,000 grains of sand add up to a beach you can no longer see the bottom of. I want to be honest with you about something. For the first month, I did not suspect Denise of anything more sinister than gossip, and even that felt like a betrayal small enough to survive. Best friends complain about husbands, and husbands complain about wives, and sometimes those complaints cross wires in ways that sting but do not destroy. I told myself that. I told myself that for weeks, the way you tell yourself a lot of things when the alternative is too frightening to hold. What I could not explain, no matter how many times I turned it over in my mind, was the mirror. Because it was not only Gerald whose behavior had changed since that gift arrived in our home. It was mine, too, in ways I did not like to admit. I began catching my own reflection more than usual. In windows, in the backs of spoons, in the black screen of the television before I turned it on. And each time, for just a fraction of a second, I felt a jolt of something like fear, though I could not have told you what I was afraid of. I am not a superstitious woman. I want that understood clearly before I go any further, because what I am about to tell you will sound, at first, like the ramblings of an old woman who has read too many of those little paperback novels with lurid covers that they sell at the pharmacy checkout line. But I raised 3 children with the practical mind of a nurse, which is what I was for 31 years before I retired, and I do not believe in curses. I believe in evidence. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from suspecting someone you love without yet having the proof to justify the suspicion, and I do not think anyone talks about it enough. It is not the loneliness of being left. It is the loneliness of standing in your own kitchen, stirring a pot of soup, and running an entire secret trial in your head, presenting evidence to yourself, cross-examining your own doubts, delivering a verdict, and then overturning that verdict 20 minutes later because you cannot bear for it to be true. I did that, some version of it, every single day for nearly 6 weeks. I would decide, with total conviction, that Gerald was simply tired, that Denise was simply going through something of her own, that I was the problem, that I had become exactly the controlling, joyless woman Gerald had accused me of being in his flatter, colder moments. And then I would catch some new detail. A receipt, a changed tone, a mirror angled a half inch differently than I'd left it. and the whole careful verdict I had constructed would collapse, and I would have to begin the trial all over again the next morning. I tell you this because I think many of you listening tonight know exactly what I am describing, and I do not want you to feel foolish for it. The way I sometimes felt foolish, alone in my kitchen with a wooden spoon in my hand, arguing with myself about whether I had the right to trust my own eyes. You have that right. You have always had that right. The people who benefit from you doubting your own perception are rarely the people who deserve your loyalty in the first place. And the evidence, when I finally allowed myself to look at it plainly, formed a shape I did not want to see. The decision to act did not arrive suddenly, the way lightning splits a tree. It arrived the way water rises in a basement, slowly, and then all at once, until one morning you step down the stairs and the water is at your ankles, and you understand, with total clarity, that this has been happening for a long time, and you simply had not been looking down. I think, looking back, that some part of me had already begun preparing long before I consciously admitted it to myself. I had started keeping better records of our shared expenses, telling myself it was simply good housekeeping. I had started calling Frank about an unrelated property question that, in hindsight, was not entirely unrelated at all. The mind protects itself in strange ways, sometimes arriving at readiness before it allows the heart to catch up and name what it is being readied for. The moment that made me look down was small. It was a Tuesday. Gerald had gone to the store early, and I was tidying the living room, and I noticed that the mirror above our fireplace had been moved. Not far, just an inch or two to the left, angled slightly differently than I had hung it. I stood in front of it and adjusted it back into place, and as I did, I caught sight of a piece of folded paper tucked behind the frame, wedged between the bronze backing and the wall. I want to tell you I hesitated before I unfolded it. I did not. 10 years of marriage and 42 years of friendship had earned me. I decided in that moment the right to know what was hidden behind my own fireplace. It was not a note. It was a receipt, faded and soft with handling, from a shop I had never heard of. Sable and Root, in the old part of downtown, the kind of shop with a hand-painted sign and a bell on the door that I had walked past 100 times without ever once going inside. The receipt listed a single item: mirror, antique frame, bespoke preparation, as discussed. $250, paid in cash. Signed, in looping cursive at the bottom, was a name I knew as well as my own hand, Denise Calloway. Bespoke preparation, as discussed. I did not know, standing there with that receipt trembling slightly in my fingers, exactly what those words meant. But I knew, in the way you know a storm is coming before the sky has fully darkened, that they meant something, and that whatever it was, it had not been meant for my good. I called my sister first, because that is what you do, and she told me I was overreacting, that Gerald and I had been through rough patches before and always come out the other side, and maybe I should focus less on old mirrors and more on date nights. I love my sister. I did not call her again about it. The person I called next was Talia Ruiz, who had lived 2 doors down from us for 11 years, and who I had never, in all that time, heard say an unkind word about anyone. Which is precisely why I trusted what she said the day I sat at her kitchen table and told her everything: the mirror, the receipt, the shop, the strange flatness that had settled over my husband like a second skin. Talia did not laugh at me. She got very quiet, and then she said, "My aunt used to talk about a woman who ran a shop like that back when I was young. People went to her for things they didn't want to say out loud." She looked at me steadily. "I'm not saying I believe in any of it, Rosalind. I'm saying I believe you noticed something real, and you should trust that, whatever the explanation turns out to be." "What do I do with that?" I asked her. "I can't exactly walk up to Denise and ask if she's cursed my marriage. She'll have me committed before she'll admit to anything." Talia wrapped both hands around her mug and considered the question the way she considered most things, slowly, without rushing toward the easy answer. "You don't ask her anything," she said finally. "Not yet. You find out everything you can on your own, quietly, and you let her keep believing you don't suspect a thing. People like that. The ones who plan. They get careless the moment they think they've already won. Let her think she's already won, Rosalind. That's when she'll make her mistake." Talia had never liked Denise. I learned that afternoon, though she had been too gracious in 11 years of neighborly friendship to ever say so directly. "It wasn't anything specific," she admitted when I pressed her. "Just a feeling I got, watching the two of you together sometimes. She always seemed to be measuring something. Herself against you. Maybe. I don't know. I told myself it wasn't my business, and mostly, it wasn't. Until now. I asked her whether she had noticed anything about Gerald, too, in those months, and she considered the question with the same careful weight she gave everything. He seemed like a man carrying something heavy that he didn't want to put down in front of anyone, she said. I assumed it was work. I didn't want to assume worse than that without a reason to. I asked Talia why she was so certain there would be a mistake at all. She looked at me with something between sympathy and steel, the look of a woman who had clearly buried a few illusions of her own over the years. Because people who do things like this are never as careful as they think they are, she said. They're too busy congratulating themselves to check behind them. I did not fully believe her that afternoon. I believe her completely now. That was enough for me. I did not need Talia to believe in curses. I needed one person in my life who believed that what I was seeing was real, and not the invention of a woman losing her grip on her own marriage. She gave me that, sitting at her kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee going cold between us, and I have loved her for it ever since. The plan, when it finally took shape, had 3 parts, and I built each one with the same careful patience I once used to check medications against a chart, twice, before I ever administered them to a patient. The first part was information. I needed to know what bespoke preparation meant, and I needed to know it from someone who was not going to lie to me the way the people closest to me apparently had been. I went to Sable and Root on a Thursday morning, alone, dressed plainly, and I did not mention my own name or my husband's. I told the woman behind the counter. Her name tag read M. Okafor, that a friend had recommended a mirror for a difficult family situation, and I wanted to understand what she offered before I committed to anything. Marguerite Okafor looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that told me she had seen a great many women walk through her door with careful, edited versions of the truth, and she said, I sell antiques, mostly. Sometimes people ask me to have them blessed, or the opposite, before they give them as gifts. I don't ask what they intend by it. I just do the work they pay for. And what does the opposite look like? I asked. She studied me a moment longer. A binding, she said finally. Something meant to attach one person's misfortune or one person's resentment to another. I don't claim it works the way people hope it will. But I don't refuse the request, either. People pay for peace of mind, one way or another. I left that shop with something I had not had in 6 weeks, certainty. Not certainty that a mirror could ruin a marriage through some ancient malevolence. I was, and remain, too practical a woman for that. But certainty that Denise Calloway had walked into that shop with intention. Certainty that whatever she believed she was doing to my life, she had believed it enough to pay $250 in cash for it. And certainty, most of all, that a woman who plans something that carefully is not a woman who trips accidentally into an affair. She builds toward it. The second part of my plan required patience of a different kind. I began, quietly, to document. I am a nurse by training, and nurses know that a chart is only as useful as it is thorough. I wrote down every strange comment Gerald made and the date he made it. I noted the nights he came home late from the hardware store, and I began, without telling him, to check the store's hours against his arrival times. I photographed the receipt from Sable and Root before returning it exactly where I had found it, tucked behind the mirror's frame, so that nothing in our house would look disturbed. And I called Frank Delgado. Frank had handled the paperwork when Gerald and I refinanced our house 11 years ago, and he had a reputation in Millbrook for being the sort of lawyer who did not waste your money asking questions he already knew the answer to. I sat in his office on a rainy Wednesday and told him I wanted to understand exactly what belonged to me, separately from Gerald, if our marriage were to end. I did not tell him about the mirror. I did not need to. I needed him to tell me about deeds and accounts and the small inheritance from my mother that I had, wisely it turned out, kept in an account under my name alone. You're asking me this because you think something's coming, Frank said, not unkindly, sliding his glasses up his nose. I'm asking you this because I intend to be ready for whatever is coming, I told him. There's a difference. Frank smiled at that, the first real smile I'd seen in weeks that wasn't followed by something bitter underneath it. Good, he said. Most people wait until the water's already in the house before they ask where the shutoff valve is. Over the following 2 weeks, with Frank's quiet guidance, I moved my mother's inheritance into an account Gerald had never known existed. Not out of any earlier deception. place to stand is the one nobody expects you to have already reached. I also went back to Sable en route a second time, a week later, this time with a different question for Marguerite Okafor. I asked her, plainly, whether she remembered the woman who had purchased the mirror and whether she recalled anything about what had been discussed. Marguerite was cautious at first. She had a business to protect and a certain code of discretion that I respected even as I pushed against it. But when I told her, without embellishment, what had happened to my marriage in the weeks since that mirror was hung above my fireplace, something in her posture softened. She came in twice, Marguerite told me. The first time, just to look. The second time, she brought a photograph with her. A man, middle-aged, salt and pepper hair. She asked me if I could prepare something that would make a person feel. Marguerite paused, choosing her words with visible care. Estranged. From someone close to her. She said it was for a friend's own good, but the friend's husband needed to see her more clearly. Marguerite shook her head slowly. I don't sell clarity, Mrs. Hartley. I sell objects and sometimes intention. What people do with either one is their own business. But I remember thinking, even then, that a woman who talks about her friend's own good while buying something like that isn't thinking about her friend's good at all. I thanked her, and I meant it, because she had just handed me the last piece I needed. Not proof that would satisfy a court, but proof enough for me. A woman who had learned long ago that certainty comes in more than one legally admissible form. In the evenings, while Gerald worked later and later at a store that did not need him there, I sat at our kitchen table with a yellow legal pad Frank had given me, and I built, line by line, the case I would eventually lay out at that dinner table. Not for a judge, but for myself, so that when the moment came, I would not falter, would not soften, would not let a single detail slip past me the way. Details had been slipping past me for months. Building a case against the two people you love most in the world is a strange, cold occupation, and I do not recommend it to anyone who has another choice available to them. Every piece of evidence I gathered felt like proof of two things at once: that I had been right to suspect what I suspected, and that something precious had genuinely ended in a way no amount of preparation could soften. I would sit with the legal pad in front of me some nights and simply stop writing for a while, staring at Gerald's side of the closet through the open bedroom door, at his reading glasses still sitting on the nightstand exactly where he always left them, and I would let myself grieve for 10 minutes, exactly 10 by the clock, before picking the pen back up. I do not think preparation and grief have to take turns waiting for each other. I think, if you let them, they can sit at the same table, sharing the same pot of tea, taking turns speaking without either one needing to shout the other into silence. There was one afternoon during that period I have never told anyone about, not even Talia, and I think I am ready to tell it now. I went to the bank where Gerald and I had kept our joint account for 26 years, and I asked to speak with the manager, a soft-spoken man named Peter Whitlock, who had, over the years, watched our small deposits grow into something more substantial through nothing more dramatic than patience and consistency. I told him I needed to review recent activity on the account, and he pulled it up without asking why, the particular courtesy of a man who has learned not to make people explain themselves for wanting to know their own business. What I found there was not evidence of an affair. Not directly, no charges from restaurants I didn't recognize, no hotel bills, Gerald having apparently been careful enough, or perhaps simply old-fashioned enough, to keep whatever cash changed hands between him and Denise away from any paper trail. But I did find something else. 3 withdrawals, each for exactly $400, made in cash, roughly 10 days apart, going back nearly 2 months, almost exactly since the anniversary party. Peter noticed me staring at the pattern and, without my asking, said quietly, "Some men get careful right around the time they start needing to be careful, Mrs. Hartley. I don't say that to alarm you. I say it because you looked like a woman who already suspected as much and just needed someone else to say it out loud." I thanked him, and I did not cry in front of him either, though I wanted to, sitting in that small windowless office with its motivational calendar on the wall and its smell of stale coffee. I cried later, in the car, in the parking lot, for exactly 4 minutes by the clock on my dashboard, and then I wiped my face, reapplied my lipstick in the rearview mirror, and drove home to make dinner, because grief, I have learned, does not require an audience, and neither does resolve. I went back to Sable en route one final time before the dinner, not to ask Marguerite anything new, but simply to thank her, because I understood by then that she had given me something valuable without ever once being obligated to. She surprised me that day by refusing to take payment for either of my visits. "You didn't come here to buy anything," she said. "You came here to understand something. I don't charge you." She paused, then added, almost gently, "For what it's worth, Mrs. Hartley, the mirrors I sell don't have any power at all." Not really. I've always believed the real power is in what people give themselves permission to do once they've paid for the feeling of having tried something. Your husband didn't fall out of love with you because of a piece of bronze and glass. He fell out of love with the version of himself that had to look you in the eye while he did what he was already choosing to do. I have thought about that sentence more than almost anything else anyone said to me during that entire ordeal. It was during this period that the discovery happened, the one that turned suspicion into certainty so complete it left no room for doubt or for mercy. I had gone to the hardware store on a Friday afternoon to bring Gerald a sandwich, something I had done 100 times over the years without a second thought, and I found the front door locked at 2 in the afternoon, a note taped inside the glass that read, "Closed for inventory." I knew, because I had worked beside him for years doing the books, that Gerald never closed for inventory on Friday. He did it in January, always, when the shop was slowest. I did not know. I walked around to the back, where a small window looked into the stock room, half covered by a stack of boxes that had shifted over time to leave a gap wider than my head. And through that gap, I saw my husband of 10 years standing very close to Denise Hartley, her hand resting on his chest in a way that was not the gesture of a friend checking on a friend. And I heard him say, in a voice I recognized, but that I had not heard directed at me in longer than I wanted to admit, "I don't know how I ever thought I could live like this." I did not cry. I want you to understand that, because I think it matters. I stood there in the gravel behind the hardware store, 42 years of friendship, and 10 years of marriage arranged in front of me like a museum exhibit I was only now allowed to walk through, and what I felt was not grief. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that comes, I imagine, to a woman who has spent months squinting at a photograph held too close to her face, and then finally, holds it at arm's length and sees the whole picture at once. I did not leave immediately. I stood there a moment longer, and I heard Denise say something that has stayed lodged in me ever since. The way a splinter stays lodged even after the skin closes over it. "She'll never suspect," Denise said. "She trusts me more than she trusts herself. That's always been her problem." And Gerald laughed. Not cruelly, which somehow made it worse, but easily, the laugh of a man who had stopped seeing anything wrong with the conversation he was having. I drove home. I made dinner. I did not say a word to Gerald when he came home 2 hours later, smelling faintly of a perfume that had never in 10 years belonged to our house. I went back once more, 3 days later, not because I needed further proof. I already had more than enough. But because some stubborn, wounded part of me needed to know how far it went, the way you press on a bruise even after you already know it hurts. This time, I did not hide by the window. I parked across the street, in the lot behind the pharmacy, and I watched Denise's car pull up to the side entrance at 1:30 in the afternoon. The same careful, practiced angle Talia would later describe to me before I had ever mentioned it to her myself, as if the two of them had unknowingly memorized the same small, damning choreography from 2 entirely different vantage points. I watched Gerald let her in through the back door instead of the front, a small detail that told me everything about how long this had been planned and how carefully. I did not go inside that day, either. I sat in my car for 11 minutes. I remember the exact number because I watched the clock on my dashboard the entire time, as though counting the minutes might somehow slow down what was happening inside that building. And then I drove home, and I added the date, the time, and the detail about the back entrance to the yellow legal pad, in the same steady handwriting I had once used to chart a patient's. Vitals through a long night shift, because grief, I was discovering, could be managed the same way pain is managed on a hospital floor. Not by pretending it isn't there, but by tracking it precisely enough that it cannot ambush you later. 2 days after that, Talia called me. Her voice careful in the particular way people's voices get careful when they are about to tell you something they wish they didn't have to. "I saw Denise's car outside the store again this afternoon," she said. "Parked around the side, where you can't see it from the road unless you're looking for it." "I wasn't looking for it, Rosalind. I just happened to be driving past." She hesitated. "I thought you should know there's a pattern to where she parks. She's careful about it. That's not an accident, and I didn't want you to hear it from anyone else first." I thanked her, and I wrote the date and time down on the same yellow legal pad where I had already begun keeping my own record, because a pattern, once you start writing it down, stops looking like a coincidence and starts looking like exactly what it is. The counter move I made in the days that followed was quiet, and it was thorough, and it was the part of this story I am least ashamed of and most proud of in the particular order those two feelings tend to arrive. I called Frank again, and this time I told him everything. The mirror, the shop, the receipt, the gravel behind the hardware store. He did not gasp or gape. He simply nodded, the way a good doctor nods when you finally describe the symptom that makes the diagnosis obvious, and he said, "Then let's make sure that when this comes out, you're the only person in the room who isn't surprised." We drew up documents. We confirmed, with absolute precision, what was mine. My mother's inheritance, protected in its own account. The small rental property I had owned before Gerald and I married, which had always remained, by careful accident, solely in my name. My pension from 31 years of nursing, untouchable by anyone but me. We confirmed what was shared and what portion of it the law said belonged to me, regardless of what Gerald or Denise believed they were entitled to. Frank filed nothing yet. "There's a difference," he told me, "between being ready to leave and being ready to be pushed. You want to choose the moment." There was one more piece of preparation I made that had nothing to do with money, and I think it mattered more than any of the paperwork. I called my two grown children, David and Marianne, and I told them, plainly and without drama, that their father had been unfaithful, and that I intended to handle it with dignity, and that whatever happened, I did not want them to feel caught between us. David went quiet on the phone for a long moment and then said, "Mom, I don't know how you're this calm." And I told him the truth, that I was not calm, that I had simply had weeks to practice looking calm, which is a different thing entirely, and sometimes the only thing available to me. Marianne cried, and then asked if she could come stay with me for the reveal, and I told her no, gently, because I did not want an audience for that dinner. I wanted a reckoning, not a spectacle. I also spent an evening with a woman named Coretta Simmons, a retired judge who attended my church, and who I had known casually for years, and I asked her, over tea, what she thought a fair settlement looked like for a marriage like mine. She did not flinch at the question, the way some people do when you ask them something that requires them to imagine being paid. "Fair," she told me, "is whatever the law says it is, plus whatever you're brave enough to ask for." Most women ask for less than they're entitled to because they're afraid of looking greedy. Don't be afraid of that, Rosalie. Greed is taking what isn't yours. This would only be taking back what already is. I held onto that sentence for the rest of that difficult season. The way you hold onto a railing on a staircase you don't entirely trust. I chose it 3 weeks later, on a Sunday, when I invited Gerald and Denise both to dinner under the pretense of finally discussing, calmly, whatever had been troubling our marriage. Denise arrived first, wearing a green dress I had once complimented her on at a dinner party years before, sitting down across from me with the easy comfort of a woman who believed she had already won, and was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up to the fact. She complimented the roast. She asked, with what almost sounded like genuine warmth, how my sister was doing, and I answered her plainly, because there is a particular kind of discipline in being pleasant to someone in the final hour before you dismantle their entire version of events, and I intended to practice that discipline all the way through. Gerald arrived 20 minutes later, and I watched something pass between them across my own dining table. A glance, brief and practiced, the kind two people exchange when they have already rehearsed how a difficult conversation is going to go. He sat at the head of the table, in the chair he had sat in for 29 years, and for one strange moment, I found myself grieving not the marriage that was ending, but the ordinary Tuesday night version of us that had once existed in that exact configuration of chairs, before either of us had anything to hide. They had not rehearsed for what I actually said. "I know about Sable and Root," I told Denise, before either of them had finished sitting down. "I know about the $250 you paid Marguerite Okafor for a bespoke preparation. I know what she told me a binding is meant to do." Denise's face did not move, not at first, but her hand, resting on the table, went very still. "And I know," I continued, turning to Gerald, "that on the Friday your store was closed for an inventory you never do in the spring. I stood behind it and heard you tell her you couldn't imagine living without her, The silence that followed was the longest silence of my life, and I let it stretch because I had learned, over 3 decades of nursing, that people reveal the most true things about themselves in the seconds right after they realize they have been caught. Gerald broke first. "Rosalind, I can explain." "You can," I agreed. "But I'm not sure you should waste the breath, because I already know everything I need to know, and everything I've done to prepare for this evening happened while the two of you were still congratulating yourselves on how careful you'd been." I looked at Denise. 42 years, Denise. $6,000 when your car was repossessed. A summer's rent when your marriage ended. A loan I never asked you to repay for a flower shop that failed in 18 months. I never once kept score. But I want you to know that I could, if I chose to, and the number would make you sick. Denise's composure cracked then, not into tears, but into something colder and more honest. "You don't understand what it's like," she said. "Watching you have everything, effortlessly, your whole life, while I don't have everything effortlessly," I said. "I have what I built, slowly, the same way anyone builds anything that lasts. You didn't envy my life, Denise. You envied not having to build on your own." "That's not fair," she said, her voice rising for the first time. "You don't know what it's like to feel invisible next to someone." "I know exactly what that feels like," I told her, and I meant it, because I had spent the last 2 months learning it in my own kitchen, in my own bed, in the reflection of a mirror she had chosen for me herself. The difference between us, Denise, is that when I felt invisible, I didn't decide the solution was to erase someone else's life to make room for mine. Gerald tried once more. "Rosalind, please, let me just." "You had months to explain," I said, my voice even, because I had promised myself I would not raise it, not once, no matter how much of me wanted to. "You had 100 quiet evenings where you could have sat across from me and told me the truth, and instead you sat across from her in a stock room, telling her you couldn't imagine living without something you'd built behind my back. I'm not interested in an explanation. I'm interested in making sure you both understand exactly how much I already know, so that neither of you spends the next 6 months telling this town a version of the story where I'm the one who didn't see it coming." Denise stood up so fast, her chair scraped hard against the floor. "This is exactly what I mean," she said, her voice shaking, though whether from anger or something closer to shame, I could not tell and did not particularly care. "You always have to be the one who's in control, the one who already knew, the one 3 steps ahead." "I wasn't 3 steps ahead, Denise," I said quietly. "I was simply paying attention, for once, to the person standing right beside me, instead of assuming she'd never do what she was already doing." I turned back to Gerald. "As for you, I've already spoken to Frank Delgado. Everything that's legally mine has been mine, quietly, for weeks. My mother's account, the rental property, my pension. You can have the mirror," I added, glancing at the bronze frame above the fireplace. "I never want to see it again, and I suspect, now, that neither will you, once whatever spell it was meant to cast on this house finally wears off. Because I don't think it was magic that changed you, Gerald. I think it was permission. Someone finally gave you permission to become the kind of man who could do this, and you took it." After they left that night, Denise first, her heels loud and uneven against my porch steps, and Gerald a few minutes later, standing in the doorway for a long moment as though he wanted to say something further and could not locate the words for it. I sat alone at my dining table for nearly an hour, the roast going cold, the candles burning down to nothing, and I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that, because I think the videos and stories that promise you triumph at the end of a betrayal, like this one, do a disservice to how it actually feels. I felt hollowed out. I felt like a woman who had just performed a surgery on her own life, while fully conscious, competently, without a single tremor in her hands, and was only now, in the silence afterward, allowing herself to feel the full weight of the incision. I called Talia at nearly 10 o'clock that night, later than either of us usually called each other, and she picked up on the second ring as though she had been waiting by the phone, which, she told me afterward, she had been. I told her everything. Every word, every reaction, the way Denise's chair had scraped against the floor, the way Gerald's face had gone the color of old paper. Talia listened without interrupting, the way she always did. And when I finished, she said only, "You did that exactly the way you should have." Now let yourself feel whatever you're feeling. You've earned every version of it. The anger, the grief, even the relief, if that's in there somewhere too. It was, if I am honest. Relief was in there, tangled up with everything else, and it took me a long time to stop feeling guilty about that particular thread, as though relief at the end of my marriage meant I had failed at loving Gerald properly, rather than simply meaning that some exhausted, watchful part of me could finally set down a weight it had been carrying, quietly, for months. The reckoning, when it came, showed me two very different people. Denise left that night without another word, and within the month, the affair that had cost her a friendship of 42 years had also cost her whatever remained of her dignity in Millbrook. People talk, in a town that size, and they did not talk kindly. She lost her seat on the library fundraising committee, quietly, without anyone ever officially saying why. Old friends who had once split appetizers with her at the diner on 5th Street began finding reasons to sit at other tables. I did not orchestrate any of that, and I want to be honest and say that I did not need to. A town remembers who was kind to it for 42 years, and it remembers, just as clearly, who wasn't. Gerald, to his eventual and grudging credit, did not run from what he had done. He called me 3 days later, not to ask for forgiveness, but to ask, quietly, what he owed me. Not financially, but as a man who finally understood the size of what he had thrown away. I did not answer that question for him that day. I told him only that I would be filing for divorce through Frank's office and that he should retain his own counsel, because I intended to be treated fairly, and I intended to make certain the law agreed with me. My children handled it in their own ways, the way grown children always do, carrying pieces of both their parents into how they responded. David stopped speaking to his father for nearly 4 months, a silence Gerald never once tried to argue his way out of, which told me something about the shape of the shame he was actually carrying underneath the calm phone calls he made to me. Marianne was gentler about it, in the end, not because she excused what her father had done, but because she had inherited, I think, my own stubborn belief that people are allowed to be more than the worst thing they ever did, provided they do the long, unglamorous work of proving it, which Gerald, to his credit, eventually began to do, slowly, one small, honest conversation at a time. There was one encounter with Denise's cousin, a woman named Priscilla, who I had met perhaps a dozen times over the decades at holiday gatherings and the occasional wedding, that I think about now more than I expected to. She stopped me outside the pharmacy about 6 weeks after the dinner and said, without much preamble, "I want you to know not everyone in that family thinks she was right to do what she did. Some of us grew up watching her do smaller versions of the same thing her whole life, taking what she wanted and calling it fate, or love, or bad luck, anything but what it actually was." I thanked Priscilla for saying so, though I told her, honestly, that it did not change much for me either. It is a strange kind of comfort, hearing that someone's cruelty was a pattern rather than an aberration. It does not undo the specific guilty done to you. It simply tells you that you were never as special a case as the betrayer. Did you feel? Denise never called. Not once, not in the 8 months the divorce took to finalize, not in the 2 years since. I understand the silence better than I understand almost anything else in the story. Some kinds of shame cannot survive being spoken out loud, and I think Denise knew, on some level, that if she ever opened her mouth to apologize, the whole architecture of the story she had built for herself, the one where she was simply a woman who fell in love, helplessly, unavoidably, would collapse under the weight of everything else she'd have to admit alongside it. The divorce was finalized 8 months later. I kept the rental property, my pension, my mother's inheritance, and half of everything Gerald and I had built jointly across 29 years of marriage. A fair split, arrived at not through cruelty, but through the simple, unglamorous fact of having prepared before I ever needed to. A year after the divorce was finalized, I ran into Gerald at the farmer's market on Saturday morning, both of us reaching for the same basket of late summer tomatoes at Delaney's stand, and there was a moment of pure, ordinary awkwardness that almost made me laugh out loud because it was so mundane compared to everything that had come before it. He looked older than I remembered, though it had only been a little over a year, and there was a tiredness in his face that I recognized as the particular exhaustion of a man living with the consequences of a decision he can no longer undo or explain away. We talked for a few minutes, carefully, about nothing important. His sister's health, whether the tomatoes were as good as last year's, a mutual friend's new grandbaby. And then he said, quietly, before we parted, "I think about that dinner more than I think about almost anything else, Roz." Not Rosalind, Roz. The old name, the one from before. I keep trying to understand how I let it get that far before I said anything. I did not offer him comfort, and I did not offer him cruelty either. I simply said, "I think you already know the answer, Gerald." You didn't want to say anything, because saying it out loud would have made you responsible for it sooner. He nodded, slowly, and did not argue, and we went our separate ways with our respective baskets of tomatoes, and I drove home and made a sauce that afternoon that was, if I am honest, the best I had made all summer, and I do not think that was an accident. Some part of me needed, that particular day, to prove to myself that I could still build something good with my own two hands, unassisted by anyone's forgiveness or apology. I heard, secondhand, through the particular grapevine that exists in every small town, that Denise had moved 2 counties over within the year, to a town where nobody yet knew her story, where she could begin again as a woman with no complicated history attached to her name. I understood that impulse better than I let on to anyone who told me about it. There is a kind of mercy in being able to disappear from the wreckage of your own choices and start over somewhere the wreckage isn't visible. I do not begrudge her that mercy, though I notice, and I think it matters, that she had to leave everything behind to find it, while I got to stay exactly where I was, in the town I loved, among the people who had watched me build my life honestly for 30 years, and simply keep building. I think often, now, about what I learned from that mirror, and it is not what Denise intended for me to learn. She meant it, I believe, as an instrument of destruction, a way of pulling apart something she could not build for herself. What it taught me instead was this, that the people who love us the least loudly are often the ones who have thought the most carefully about how to protect us. And that a woman who has spent her whole life being called quiet or careful or old-fashioned is very often the same woman who has been paying attention the entire time, gathering the evidence she will need on the one day she finally decides to use it. I do not believe, even now, in curses. But I believe in intention, and I believe that what Denise Calloway paid $250 to set into motion in my home revealed something about her that no mirror could have hidden, that she had spent 42 years being my friend and secretly resenting every year of it. I would rather know that truth, cold as it was to receive, than continue living warmly inside a lie. If you are sitting somewhere tonight, feeling underestimated by someone who claims to love you, I want you to hear this clearly. Quiet is not the same as weak, and patient is not the same as powerless. Gather what is yours, learn what protects you. And when the moment comes, because it will come in its own time, do not rush toward it in anger. Walk toward it the way I did, calmly, with the receipts already in your hand. I want to say one more thing, because I think it is the truest thing I have learned in 68 years of living, and it did not come cheaply. Betrayal has a way of making you doubt not just the person who betrayed you, but every instinct you have ever had about anyone. For a while, after Gerald and Denise, I found myself looking too closely at every kindness offered to me, wondering what it was actually in service of, what hidden ledger someone else might secretly be keeping against me the way, without ever quite admitting it to myself, I had once kept one for Denise. That is a natural response to what happened to me. But I want to tell you, gently, that it is not a place to live permanently. I did not stop trusting people. I simply got better at trusting the right ones. The Talias, the Franks, the Marguerites, the quiet, unglamorous people who show up, not because it flatters them to be seen showing up, but because showing up is simply who they have always been. I also want to say something about anger. Because I know some of you listening tonight are angrier than I allowed myself to sound in most of this story, and I do not want you to think I am telling you anger is wrong. It isn't. I was angry. I am still angry on certain nights when I let myself sit with it instead of moving briskly past it toward the next practical task. But I learned, somewhere in those months of quiet preparation, that anger makes a poor architect. It will help you feel something, fiercely, for a little while. Not help you build the life you actually need to walk into once the fury has burned itself down to embers. Plan with your anger nearby if you must, but do not let it hold built a good life once, and when it was taken from me, I found, to my own surprise, that I still remembered how to build another one. Some nights, when the garden is quiet and the coffee has gone cold on the table beside me, I think about that mirror still hanging somewhere in a house that used to be mine. And I wonder if it ever really held any power at all, or whether it was only ever a very expensive way of giving two frightened, dishonest people permission to become smaller versions of themselves. I have decided, in the end, that it does not matter which is true. What matters is that I am still here, whole, in a house I chose, surrounded by people who have never once needed a spell to love me honestly. That is the only magic I have ever actually needed, and it turns out I had it in me the entire time. If this story stayed with you, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me, what would you have done in my place? And from where in the world are you listening? I read every message, and you mean more to me than you know. For more stories like this one, like this video, and subscribe. There is so much more waiting for you. With love and respect. Until next time.